The increase in engine power guaranteed a serious improvement in the flight performance of the flying wing. Therefore, work on the piston-powered version of the aircraft was deemed impractical. All efforts of the company were redirected toward converting 2 unfinished airframes. The contract for converting the 2 aircraft to jet engines was signed by the United States Army Air Forces on the 1st of June, 1945. According to the designer's plan, instead of 4 piston engines, 8 Allison turbojet engines were to be installed. They were arranged in 2 groups, 4 engines on each half wing. However, this required sacrificing 2 bomb bays. The new modification was initially given one designation, then changed, and finally received its official name during construction, YB-49. To install the jet engines, the engine bays and air intakes of the bomber had to be completely redesigned. On the piston version, the propellers and engine shaft fairings increased the directional stability of the aircraft. Their absence in the new version naturally reduced stability, which could lead to accidents. Therefore, John Northrop decided to compensate for this drawback by installing vertical fins. 4 small trapezoidal fins were placed on both the upper and lower surfaces of the wing. The calculated speed of the new aircraft was no less than that of the fighters of the time. For this reason, the defensive armament was reduced to a minimum, leaving only the tail gun position. This also made it possible to completely clear the surface of the wing from protruding elements, improving the aerodynamic efficiency of the aircraft and other related characteristics. Construction was scheduled to be completed by June 1946, but wind tunnel tests showed insufficient efficiency of the additional fins. Their surface area had to be increased by adding long ribs extending from the fin base to the leading edge of the wing. In addition, the designers decided to replace the engines with more powerful ones, equipped with afterburners. All these unforeseen changes delayed construction by a year. The first example of the new jet bomber YB-49 was ready only by the fall of 1947. The letter Y emphasized the pre-production status of the aircraft and confirmed the confidence of the Air Force in the machine. The assignment of the serial number 49 indicated that the aircraft was a participant in the competition among jet bombers and was no longer considered a rival to the production aircraft built by Convair. The design of a new generation of bombers by American aircraft companies began in November 1944, when the main requirements for such aircraft were announced: a flight range of 3,523 miles, a service ceiling of 45,000 feet, and a maximum speed of 554 miles per hour. 4 companies participated in the program with their experimental machines, and their prototypes showed quite good results. Now, a 5th experimental aircraft joined them, the YB-49 jet bomber by Northrop. Calculations showed that with a bomb load of 10,009 pounds, the bomber could fly 3,999 miles at a speed of 450 miles per hour, with a maximum speed of about 497 miles per hour. This aircraft was the first to use a fully irreversible hydraulic control system. The crew arrangement remained unchanged. From 7 to 10 people were located in the center of the flying wing. In the tail cone, there were 4 sleeping berths where the crew could rest during long flights. From its piston predecessor, the YB-49 inherited high climb performance and good maneuverability. The closest competitor to the flying wing in flight performance was a bomber built by the Martin Company. It was a monoplane of classical design, but far more advanced than it is often described. The aircraft had a thin wing with a high-speed airfoil and a pair of large engine nacelles of a special shape that created additional lift. To reduce air resistance, it used a bicycle landing gear system with the struts retracting into the fuselage instead of the wings. Glenn Martin, the head of the company, was determined to win the competition. To speed up the work, everyone involved in the aircraft's creation was placed directly in the workshop where the prototype was being assembled. Even typists, draftsmen, and accountants worked there. Thanks to this, all necessary documents were prepared almost instantly without bureaucratic delays. The first flight took place on June 22, 1947, and lasted 37 minutes. The landing was carried out at the Patuxent River Naval Air Station, which had an especially long runway. Interestingly, the engines emitted heavy smoke during the flight, and local residents flooded the police with calls about a plane on fire. The first flight of the next model occurred on October 21, 1947, at 9:46 in the morning. The military testing program was headed by Robert Cardenas, with Lieutenant Denny Forbes as his co-pilot. The initial phase of testing was conducted by the company's test pilot, Max Stanley. He was familiar with all the peculiarities of flying the Northrop Flying Wing, performed his portion of the tests brilliantly, and then handed the aircraft over to the military. On January 19, 1948, the second phase of testing began. Cardenas took the commander's seat under the raised canopy and lifted the machine into the air. He quickly noticed that apart from the power plant and control system, almost nothing had changed from the earlier piston model. The landing gear retraction mechanism from the previous version operated too slowly, while the jet engines accelerated the plane very rapidly, threatening to damage the struts with air pressure. He did not dare to reduce thrust during takeoff and instead slowed the acceleration by climbing along a very steep trajectory. Finally, once the landing gear was fully retracted, Cardenas leveled the aircraft. At that moment, the fuel in the tanks also shifted into a horizontal position. A wave of liquid fuel struck the forward walls of the tanks, shifting the center of gravity forward and sending the plane into a dive. The pilot leveled it out, and the fuel sloshed backward, rocking the bomber. The oscillations gradually diminished, and the aircraft slowly stabilized. In one of the subsequent flights, Cardenas brought the aircraft to critical angles of attack. He approached the stall condition very carefully and managed to prevent both the onset of a stall and the bomber's circular motion. Some sources claim that the aircraft fell tail first at a speed of 82 feet per second. Although everything ended without incident, Cardenas did not like the aircraft's reaction. After landing, he noted in his report that deliberately entering stall conditions was undesirable. In his opinion, the bomber required greater stability, since at critical regimes, the pilot simply lacked the physical ability to react with the controls quickly enough. Yet Cardenas emphasized that the aircraft was fully controllable and that all his concerns could be addressed, though he did not specify how. Much hope for improved stability was placed on the autopilot that was planned to be installed on the aircraft. Wind tunnel tests of the model confirmed the possibility of the flying wing falling tail first. But for a 100-ton bomber, such a maneuver was highly unlikely. In March 1948, the second stage of testing for the flying wing was 70% complete. Robert Cardenas decided to leave the testing program and continue his studies at the University of Southern California. Colonel Albert Boyd, head of the Flight Test Division, allowed Cardenas to leave only on the condition that he find his own replacement. The second pilot, Denny Forbes, was not suitable for the position because he had not completed the full course at the test pilot school. Cardenas chose a young pilot, Glenn Walter Edwards, who not only had the required qualifications but had also assisted Dr. Perkins from Princeton in preparing materials for the book Stability and Control. And it was precisely these characteristics that still needed to be tested in the flying wing. Captain Edwards was a talented pilot, intelligent and well-educated. During the war, he served in the 86th Bombardment Squadron of the 47th Bombardment Group. He was sent to the front in 1942. Edwards carried out his first combat missions in North Africa against Rommel's advancing forces. The intensity of combat operations at that time was so high that on one occasion he made 11 consecutive combat sorties in his aircraft. The front line was only 20 minutes of flight from the airfield. Later, he fought in Algeria, Tunisia, and Malta, and by 1943, Edwards was stationed in Italy. In September, Glenn Edwards, already decorated with 6 combat medals, received a new assignment and returned to the United States. After successfully completing the test pilot school, he caught the attention of the command, and on July 1, 1946, he was appointed assistant head of the Flight Test Division. Soon, he was expected to join the testing program of a legendary aircraft, but Colonel Boyd appointed Charles Yeager to that position and sent Edwards to study at Princeton. Having brilliantly completed his studies, Glenn Edwards earned a degree in aerodynamics, but did not give up his dream of becoming a test pilot. In May 1948, he secured an appointment in Dayton, Ohio, where he worked on developing in-flight refueling methods for bombers from tanker aircraft. During this period, the test center had accumulated many experimental aircraft. The Bomber Testing Division, led by Cardenas, was in greatest need of qualified pilots. On May 19, 1948, Edwards was transferred to the Muroc Testing Center. He was assigned to work on the testing programs for the Flying Wing and the Tornado bomber. He considered the Flying Wing work the most interesting, as he already had experience flying a Northrop aircraft, which Edwards found stable and fully controllable. On April 26, 1948, The second prototype of the flying wing set an unofficial endurance record for jet aircraft, spending 9.5 hours in the air. For 6 of those hours, it remained at altitudes above 39,000 feet. Unfortunately, the aircraft covered only 3,500 miles, a rather modest result for an intercontinental bomber. The cause was a failure of the electric generator, forcing the pilots to shut down one engine. On May 20th, Cardenas introduced Edwards to the flying wing. Together, they conducted a test flight. Edwards sat in the co-pilot seat in the so-called hole. On the return trip, the airspeed indicators in the cockpit failed, and the pilots had to land guided only by the escort aircraft. The next day, Cardenas took the co-pilot seat, while Edwards lifted the flying wing into the air. After the flight, he noted the aircraft's insufficient stability and the difficulty of landing. The latter was caused by his first encounter with the ground effect, the principle behind the flight of an aeroplane. As it approached the ground, the enormous flying wing compressed the air beneath it. The resulting high-pressure zone prevented the aircraft from touching down. However, this difficulty was easily overcome with special landing techniques. Cardenas believed one simply needed to get used to the effect. He had once won several bets at Muroc Air Base against those who doubted that a plane could be landed exactly on a designated line. To do so, the pilot would simply push the control stick forward at the right moment, without even using air brakes. Edwards made his first solo flight on May 28, 1948. His co-pilot was the ever-reliable Denny Forbes. After making 5 or 6 flights and logging about 10 hours, they proceeded to the third and most important phase of testing, examining stability and controllability. Edwards recorded his impressions not only in official reports but also in his personal diary. A note dated June 3, 1948 reads, "What a wonderful day. First 2 flights on the aircraft, a great flight on the DC-6 and 1 on the C-74. I'm exhausted." On May 26, 1948, the bomber was officially handed over to representatives of the Air Force. The aircraft had been tested by Northrop's own pilots, who had made 24 flights totaling 50 hours. The 2 flights on the first prototype were intense, testing the aircraft's behavior with both extended and retracted landing gear, as well as the wing's high-lift devices in different positions. After these flights, the first prototype was ferried back to Northrop for preparation for a new test cycle. Its place at the testing center was taken by the second prototype, which company engineers had prepared for flights focused on studying stability and control. Aerodynamic fences that prevented airflow from moving along the swept wing smoothly transitioned into small fins that improved the aircraft's directional stability. Edwards and Forbes took the second aircraft into the air on June 4, 1948, alternating at the controls during the flight. The purpose was to calibrate the airspeed indicator and check acceleration characteristics at an altitude of 10,000 feet. After landing, the pilots called Colonel Richard Horner in Dayton and complained about the poor performance of the onboard flight data recorders when tracking Elevon behavior. Without additional data, it was difficult to determine whether the fault lay with the recorder or the control system. An additional flight was scheduled for the next morning with 2 civilian engineers, Claire Lesser and Charles LaFontaine, added to the crew. On June 5, 1948, at 6:44 in the morning, Denny Forbes occupied the pilot's seat, while Glenn Edwards sat as co-pilot. The flight engineer, Lieutenant Edward Swindell, was responsible for managing the fuel tanks in a specific order to maintain proper balance. The main goal of the flight was to test stability while simultaneously increasing engine power and angle of attack. The civilian engineers, monitoring the onboard recorders and control system, took their positions and the bomber lifted off. On that early Saturday morning, no other aircraft were in the test area, and the only information about what was happening on board came from Forbes's periodic radio reports. At 7 o'clock, he reported that the aircraft was climbing and was now over Bakersfield. Half an hour later, he transmitted that the plane was at 15,000 feet and beginning to descend, a report that seemed rather unusual. The first phase of the flight program involved climbing to an altitude of 40,000 feet, but in the previous 30 minutes, the aircraft had not been able to reach 40,000 feet and descend to 13,000 feet. It was suggested that at high altitude, the auxiliary power unit that supplied the measuring instruments had failed, and the pilots began descending to restart it. The altitude of 15,000 feet was exactly where, according to the program, the crew was supposed to begin the stability test. Around 8 in the morning, a mechanic from the airbase, according to other accounts, a pilot, was driving along the highway northwest of Muroc. Suddenly, he saw something strange in the sky, fragments of wings tumbling through the air and glittering in the sunlight. They fell into the desert, later found 3 miles from the burned-out central section of the wing. The entire bomber crew was killed. The exact cause of the crash was never fully determined. The only thing established with certainty was that the wings had torn off due to extreme overload. Calculations showed that the load must have reached at least 4.8 G. There were several versions of what might have happened. The pilot could have exceeded the permissible overload while recovering from a spin or surpassed the allowed dive speed, among other theories. But regardless of the version, one thing was certain: Forbes lost control of the aircraft. The structure could not withstand the stress, and the wing panels broke away. The crew had no time to abandon the falling plane. Danny Forbes's name was immortalized in October 1949. One of the bases of the United States Strategic Air Command was named after him. And on December 5, 1949, Muroc Air Base was renamed in honor of the fallen best test pilot of the United States Air Force. It is now known as Edwards Air Force Base. After the Northrop Company's test pilot demonstrated to representatives of the Air Force that he could recover the aircraft from a stall at a predetermined altitude, testing continued. The order to convert 9 bombers into reconnaissance aircraft was not canceled. On the contrary, an additional 30 jet reconnaissance planes were commissioned. The stability and controllability tests of the flying wing were completed by an experienced pilot, Charlie Tucker, who had already flown a Northrop experimental aircraft back in December 1948. His opinion of the aircraft could be summed up in one phrase: it was as stable as a rock. From his perspective, the only drawback of the machine was insufficient damping of yaw oscillations. His first flight in the bomber, with a center of gravity at about 22% of the mean aerodynamic chord of the wing, went perfectly. Then, the center of gravity began to be gradually shifted backward, mainly by pumping fuel. The high fuel consumption of the 8-jet engine significantly affected this process, forcing frequent returns to the airfield for refueling. Over several days, Tucker's crew made more than 20 flights, gradually testing the aircraft at 23, 24, and so on up to 32% of the chord. With each flight, controlling the bomber became increasingly difficult. The nose of the aircraft lifted higher, the angle of attack increased, and the machine began to roll to the right. By pushing the control column forward, Tucker always managed to return the plane to normal flight. But when the center of gravity reached 32%, pushing the control column had no effect. The pitch angle kept increasing, the aircraft rolled onto its right wing and began entering a barrel roll at a speed of about 150 miles per hour, while simultaneously dropping its nose. After making between 2 and 2.5 rolls, Tucker managed to regain control and pull the aircraft out of the initial spin. By that time, the speed had already reached 300 miles per hour. The overload during recovery was 2.5 G, while the limit was not to exceed 2 G. Nevertheless, the structure held, and after this incident, the bomber accumulated about 100 additional flight hours. At the next stage of testing, the flying wing was equipped with a yaw damper similar to the one installed on the bomber. The aircraft's stability improved. What followed were the first trial bomb drops. According to military pilots, their accuracy left much to be desired. They claimed that a bomb released from the bay would enter the turbulence behind the wing, and with the ineffective vibration damper, it was difficult to keep the aircraft on its combat course. The average bombing accuracy turned out to be worse than that of the older bomber. However, these claims contradicted the opinion of Charlie Tucker, who suspected that the pilots were simply turning off the damper. On January 9, 1949, the aircraft took part in a demonstration of new aviation technology at Andrews Air Force Base. It departed from Muroc Airfield and covered 2,257 miles in 4 hours and 20 minutes, with an average speed of 521 miles per hour. The commander was Robert Cardenas, the co-pilot was Max Stanley, and the flight engineer was William Cunningham. The aircraft flew over Washington, and the residents of the U.S. Capitol observed its strange silhouette. President Truman inspected the flying wing and enthusiastically uttered his famous phrase, "A damn interesting airplane. We should order a few of those." The record lasted exactly 1 month and was broken by a bomber that flew 2,304 miles at an average speed of 606 miles per hour. The visit to Andrews Air Force Base was not entirely ordinary. There are reports that the aircraft participated in tests of a secret project dedicated to the problem of invisibility. Perhaps these experiments were inspired by Max Stanley's flight near San Francisco, when local air defense radar operators could not see the bomber until they went outside and looked up. On February 23rd, the aircraft returned to Muroc. During the flight, a serious malfunction occurred. 3 engines on the right side and 1 on the left caught fire. The pilots made an emergency landing at Winslow Air Base in Arizona. It turned out that the plane had not been refueled with oil. Representatives of the Northrop Company, who had already noticed that strange misfortunes kept happening to the aircraft, accused the Air Force of sabotage. The mechanic responsible for refueling the bomber, William Cunningham, fell under the main suspicion. The material damage was significant since each engine cost about $20,000. FBI agents were called in and conducted an investigation. They classified the incident as an accidental coincidence, found no evidence of sabotage, and the case was soon forgotten. The aircraft was restored. As if confirming Northrop management's suspicions, the next mishap came quickly. On April 26, 1949, one of the engines caught fire. Repairs costing $19,000 were required. The order for 30 reconnaissance aircraft was canceled, and on May 15th, the entire development program was terminated. On that very day, the newly repaired plane was lost in an accident. During taxiing, the nose landing gear collapsed, the bomber caught fire, and the crew member sustained injuries of varying severity. The aircraft was never rebuilt. Interestingly, this bomber became humanity's last hope for victory in the war against the Martians. The unusual aircraft successfully dropped atomic bombs on Martian invaders in the 1952 American feature film, The War of the Worlds.